All right, so here we are on our first official system, the integument. And this is a good place to start, right? Because it's easy to see the things that we're going to talk about in your cells and relate to this. I mean, no, you don't see the cells, but you see the effects of all these cells working together or not working together. And so this is a good place for us to get our bearings, get our feet wet, whatever, kind of metaphor you want to think about for jumping into the analysis of a whole functional system. This is also a nice system because it's clearly all connected together. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about what belongs to the integument. Okay, and it's so. I just always remind you here that you have your course learning outcomes to consider what you're supposed to be walking away with, what kind of information and abilities, so knowledge and skills. So always check with that. I said, we do see the system every day, and we spend a lot of money on the system, right? And we do a lot of things to the system. And I just wondered, have you really thought about all the value, everything it does for you, right? And what all, how you should value the skin a little bit more, maybe. All right? So there are 5 functions I like to talk about when I talk about the integument. Clearly, it's protective, right? And here I give you an example, protecting you from abrasions, right? Scrapes, cuts, right? It protects you from UV light. We're going to look at specific cells that do that. It protects you from microbes. There are microbes all over, all around us and on our skin, and yet they cannot get into our body because of the skin. And of course, it protects us from water loss. Yay! All right. It provides a lot of our sensation. So this part of the nervous system that allows us to know when there's a problem with homeostasis, or gives us, the start to becoming aware. This is basically the general senses we talk about here with the integument: temperature, touch, pressure, pain, to name a few. It's responsible for transforming vitamin D, activating it. Okay, so there's this compound, again, based on cholesterol, because the dehydrocholesterol that is found in our skin, associated with the epidermis, and it is converted to a compound, a different chemical, when it is exposed to UV light. And this starts the process of getting us active vitamin D. This compound that we start with in the skin actually then moves into the blood system and goes to the liver and finally ends up in the kidneys. And then once we have activated vitamin D, it helps us with our absorption of calcium. Helps to regulate temperature. I think that one's hopefully pretty obvious, but we'll talk about the details involved with that. And of course, some waste can be excreted through the integument. All right, so quite a few functions to consider, so we have to look at the structures to see how we achieve these functions, right? So first and foremost, we want to look anatomically, all right? So skin is technically 2 layers. It's the epidermis and dermis. So the hypodermis is not part of our skin. It's a subcutaneous, okay? Because skin is also known as a cutaneous membrane. And the hypodermis is a lot of fat, a lot of connective tissue, then connects our integument to the muscle beneath it, all right? So again, cutaneous membrane, epidermis, epi on top of the dermis, and then a very thick dermis. So here's our epidermis here. Fairly thin dermis, pretty thick, and then starting into the hypodermis. Okay, and again, the hypodermis is not technically the skin. It is a subcutaneous, all right? So, the question is, again, what do we do here? Well, we're going to learn here that the epidermis is clearly very protective. Right? It protects us from a variety of things, the abrasions, UV light, and so forth. But it's, as we learned in the last chapter, is made of predominantly of stratified squamous tissues, and so many layers. And it turns out too that the more friction and the more contact with the outside world you have, the more layers you actually develop in your skin. So some areas of your skin are thick and some are thinner, right? The dermis makes up for all the rest. That's not really, there's protective elements, but really most of that protection is done by the epidermis. So the dermis allows us for sensation. Here's the neural tissue shown in this kind of yellow and hooking up to this muscle, the erector pili, or pili. Right, the dermis is going to be doing secretions, sweat and sebum predominantly. Again, sensation, secretions. This is where blood will actually be found to nourish all the cells. So it's going to pick up, and this blood and the flow of blood is really going to help us with our temperature regulation. All right? So when we look closely at the epidermis, there are 4 to 5 layers. Okay, so let's be clear on this. There are 4 layers all over the body. There's a 5th layer in just a few places, and the 5th layer shows up on what we call the plantar surface, the bottom of our feet, and the palmar surface, that our hands, right, our palms. And so we'll take a look at those to try to understand that as well. And then, again, the layers can vary, especially this corneum. The outermost layer that is all over your skin, the stratum corneum, is the difference between the thick and thin skin I was talking about in the last slide. Okay? So stratum is the singular, whereas strata are plural layers, right? So these are a bunch of strata, but each individual one is a stratum. So stratum corneum, right? As it shows you here, these are actually dead cells, squamous appearing cells, and you'll see this easily on the slides. And they're filled with keratin. And then this is the optional layer right here, the stratum lucidum, which is dying cells that really are clear. That's where the lucidum comes in. The next layer down, and we're moving down into the body, this is superficial to deep. The next layer down is called the stratum granulosum, and this is easy to see on a slide. It's because these cells start to, you're aware of all the little vesicles and granules of keratin in them, right? They're staying very dark. One of the next thickest layers is the stratum spinosum, and these are all keratinocytes, right? So all of this is really, your epidermis is mostly keratinocytes. We have some Merkel cells and we have some melanocytes in here too, but not a whole lot else. These keratinocytes in here and the stratum spinosum are basically, they have been produced by the basale down here, right, which is a single layer of generally cuboidal cells, and they are very, very mitotically active, always producing new cells, right? And the rate of that mitosis can change, because if you injure yourself, you need to, right, increase it. So the stratum basale has created new cells, and they get pushed upwards and become part of the stratum spinosum. In the stratum spinosum, because of genes, the cells start to change their shape and appearance, and so you can kind of distinguish them. And they begin their lifelong process of making this important protein called keratin. Right? So the cells, again, are keratinocytes. They make this compound, this protein called keratin. It's relatively hard, right? Your nails, your hair, your skin all contain different types of keratin. We do see that we could have these melanocytes in here, and these are the color, the pigment producing cells. And we have these Merkel cells for sensation. Okay? But beneath the basale, I'm going to be into the dermis. Right? So differences in thick and thin skin really have to do with the stratum corneum. There are many, many layers, and we'll see this when we look at the slides. The mitotically active layer is right here. Remember, these guys are dead. So really the most active layer is right here in the basale, all right, that sits right on top of the dermis. All right? So there's a constant loss of dead cells. They slough off or they're shed. And so it just say here that these keratinocytes in the basale, they're constantly dividing. And when we talk about things like corns and calluses, that's an increase in that stratum corneum. Right? Keratinization, right, is a process by which we are taking on more and more keratin in these cells. And eventually this really leads to the death of the cells. So they accumulate so much they can't function anymore. You also see in the epidermis these cellular junctions called desmosomes. And I said in a previous chapter, chapter 3, that the desmosomes are these adhesive junctions, and they help to, they're like reinforced stitching between these cells to really keep them all together. So skin really functions like a unit as opposed to individual cells, which is what it's made of, right? And the 5 layers, again, include the lucidum, and this is found only on the bottoms of the feet and the palms of the hands. So, again, all the cells come from the basale. It's also known as a germinativum, and it's attached to the dermis through the basal lamina. And this is just, again, a basement membrane, if you will, an extra layer that really makes them hold together. Consists of the basal cells, right, single layer of cuboidal cells, stem cells we call the stratum basale. So 2 other layers that I mentioned on the previous slide, Merkel cells, they give us this touch, fine touch on our hands, especially our hands and feet, and melanocytes, which produce melanin that protects us from UV light. In the spinosum, moving upwards, right, so we start with the basale there, and so we're moving from the deep to the superficial in this case. We get these, the cells get these odd shapes to them, and it says now we understand that shape is really kind of an artifact of the post-mortem and the staining, but that's the way we always viewed them, so the name will probably stick. There are 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes. I said this is the second thickest layer next to the corneum. And this keratin that we talk about is really a water-repelling glycolipid, right? So sugary fat is here also, I should say, and a water-repelling. So keratin's a protein, and then there's also this glycolipid made that's kind of waxy. And these substances here in the stratum spinosum help to, right, prevent that loss of water that we were talking about on the second slide. You also find another cell can be found here, and this cell is called a Langerhans cell, and it is able to consume dead and dying cells and organelles and things like that. It acts like a macrophage. All right, the stratum granulosum and lucidum. The granulosum is a much thinner layer, 3 to 5 layers. They've accumulated the keratin, and we also, there's another form that we call keratohyalin. As granules, they're flattened, so they start to look different. They stain very dark. Their organelles are disintegrating because, again, there's so much keratin. There's not any functional. They're not very functional anymore. We only find the lucidum on the palms, soles, and digits, right? So on the surface of the fingers. These are dead and flat cells with a very clear protein that's rich in lipids. So when you stain this, elidin won't pick up. It looks very uniform and clear, and that's where we get the name lucidum, like lucid, right? Your clarity. All right, topping it off is the stratum corneum. This is 15 to 30 layers again, so this would be the thickest technically. Can be thin or thick depending on, again, the use you have or the contact your skin makes with the world around it. They're dry, dead, and this is what prevents infections, right? And they also prevent dehydration because you can't lose water through these already dead cells, basically. So you have it's an extra protective layer for us. And we lose these cells constantly. So even though you don't see that necessarily in your bed sheets, right? If you look at the scanning EM or an electron or transmission electron micrograph of your bed sheets, it's like the grossest stuff in the world, right? Constantly losing these cells, entire layers renewed about every 4 weeks. So yeah, you had brand new skin, right, in 4 weeks' time. All right, we're going to stop this here, so we'll pick up on the dermis in the next video.